Good evening and welcome everybody once again here to the Wisconsin Conservative Conversations. As you know, each and every episode we have here, we like to bring on different guests, regardless of the office they're running for, be it on a state level, like the Attorney General, like we'll have a guest on tonight, or local candidates that are running for state assembly, county boards, anything like that. If you're running for an office, please feel free to reach out to me. We want to engage these conversations and bring this information out to the people. Like I told you guys before in the past, one of the big reasons we want to have these conversations is to literally do just that. The educated population is a more informed, better served population. And that's one of the things that we hope to do here by bringing this information out to you guys. And hopefully you guys get the most out of it as we can. Tonight, I'm very pleased here to have our second Attorney General candidate who is going to be running in a statewide race here. We got a primary coming up August 9th. We got a state convention coming up here just in a couple weeks. And this young lady here that we're going to have on here, she's an attorney out of here, Wisconsin, the Eau Claire area. She has her Juris Doctorate out of the University of North Dakota School of Law. And she's definitely got some interesting insights. And I definitely am very, very happy to bring her on here. I'm looking forward to having this conversation. Please welcome, ladies and gentlemen, Attorney Karen Mueller. Karen, how are you tonight?
I'm just fine. Thank you for having me. It's
So
nice to meet you.
it's a pleasure to meet because I've heard a lot about you through some mutual friends of ours, Justin Schmidt in particular and his wife, Victoria.
Okay.
Um, they speak very highly of you. And of course, I've read articles because I'm a news junkie. I can't help but read everything that's out there. But you know what they say about mainstream media? Don't believe most of it. Um, I'm just not a fan of mainstream media. And I think because there's such a bias in there. Um, but before I start this, I'm going to preface this here because I'm doing this more for YouTube or anything. I'm not a doctor. I'm not an attorney, although we do have an attorney here. Just keep in mind that the topics and everything we're going to be covering, if you got issues with that, take it up with your doctor. Don't take medical advice from a dude on the internet. That's all I'm going to tell you guys. But you're getting into the attorney general's race. You jumped into this race, so I believe it was March 19th, if I recall correctly.
Yes, it was.
Um,
hmm
we have two candidates already. You have Adam Jerkow. You got Eric Tooney, corporate attorney, district attorney, and yourself jumping in. One of the things I like to go into with folks is kind of like what was the motivation for wanting to go into any race, but in this particular case, the attorney general's race, which I would actually argue is just as important, if not more so, than the governor's race.
It could be. It could be depending on the issues. I think the issues that have motivated me to get into the race are very important. They're life and death issues, and that is what has motivated me. I spent a lot of time in the last year and a half dealing with election issues. The absentee ballot drop boxes is a case I brought to the Supreme Court within 30 days of the election. And it was one that they refused to hear. They didn't say that it was moot. They didn't decide the issue. They refused to hear the original action. But that's not what motivated me here. I had to think long and hard. I had to pray about it because obviously I'm of the age I could retire, and that seems really appealing. And yet, what I started finding was getting a lot of calls from people who were desperate for help for their loved ones in the hospital. And that is my first motivation is I have had many, many phone calls from people, and they were either calling and saying they're going to murder my loved one
Mhm.
or they have murdered my loved one. And at first, that was like astounding to be hearing something like that. Uh, I grew up in the United States of America. You don't expect to be hearing things like allegations, at least widespread, of hospitals murdering patients.
Right.
In my the first case I got was one that goes back to October, and I took that case. The health the healthcare agent was the nephew of a gentleman, and he wanted ivermectin, and he wasn't allowed to get the ivermectin. The hospital said no, the doctors said no, and so we sued in Waukesha County Court, and we got a favorable ruling from the judge. And within just a little while of that decision, the hospital appealed that, took it up to the appellate level, and the appellate court, without a motion, stayed that order so that this gentleman was not going to get his ivermectin. And I turned around and bypassed that one up to the Supreme Court and asked for them to hear the case as soon as possible. And in a two-part ruling, they again said, we're not going to hear the case. And so not only did they deny him, a dying man, the right to try, what also happened was might be very interesting to your audience, in that the conservative justices, there was Rebecca Bradley and the two other female conservatives, wrote scathing dissents, not only to the appellate court judges, but also to their fellow justices on the bench. And they are worth reading and contemplating how strongly these conservative judges felt about that. But so that's the background for me getting into it. That made the news, of course. And after that, I started getting phone calls from people, not only from within Wisconsin, but outside of Wisconsin. And the story was pretty much the same in every case.
Right.
And that's it. To boil it down, it appears that hospitals are not only withholding the ivermectin, which you could argue all day long whether that is a good drug or not. I believe it is. I believe it saved my own life.
Right.
But so I have that personal experience. I'm not a doctor, but what I will say is that as I heard more and more families calling, there became a pattern, and the pattern was not only withholding possible life-saving drugs, but the giving of drugs that have a very bad reputation. And you can just go look at the packaging and you see these are drugs that have the potential to cause significant harm, and in fact have. One of them is remdesivir. The other is not known as much, a drug called baricitinib. In the case of baricitinib, the packaging says it will cause blood clots, it will cause upper respiratory bacterial infections, and it will cause severe to lethal infections. And so you have to ask yourself, why in the world would those be the drugs that are given to people who are admitted and are being treated for COVID, where they have severe breathing problems?
Right.
And then you go along further, and after about 5 days, the people inevitably would need to go on a ventilator. And once we got beyond the ventilator, after 4 or 5 days, I had multiple family members say, and then they started badgering me about either a DNR order or a comfort care. In fact, in one very egregious case, the family said that the doctor came in and said, if you want to see your mom alive again, you'll sign the comfort care documents. This is outrageous.
Wow.
This is not one or two isolated cases. This is multiple hospitals across the state of Wisconsin, multiple ages of patients, families who are distraught. They feel like they've been tortured. They feel like their loved one was tortured, was isolated. And frankly, it also goes beyond Wisconsin. I've had calls from Florida, from Texas, California, the same type of issues, the same process. And I came to the conclusion that it was, in fact, COVID protocols that are coming out of Medicare and Medicaid. And from there, they're coming out from the FDA and the CDC. But the way that they are being brought into the hospital systems is through Medicare, Medicaid. And they are using a carrot and a stick and carrot approach, and providing monetary rewards. And I'm sure most of your listeners have heard about that.
Right.
Remdesivir, you get a 20% overall bonus on the patient bill if that is given. What people don't know is that the remdesivir and the baricitinib together give the hospitals immunity because there is an emergency use authorization
Mhm.
for that joint combination of drugs. And then, of course, once they get on the ventilator, they get $39,000 for that.
39. Wow.
39,000, yes. So there's a significant amount of money here. In that first case I mentioned, I basically argued that the decisions were not being made by the doctors anymore. These were decisions that were being made in the boardroom, and they
Mhm.
were being made for monetary gain. And
Now,
that's a serious allegation, but it's one I think needs to be investigated.
right. And it's that's one of the things that you had mentioned was using, ivermectin. And that's one thing that's become very popularized just from what the media has been putting out there because they like to first, the media likes to portray it as, oh, you're taking horse dewormer. It's an anti-parasitic. It's something that's been used for quite a number of years. And there's studies that have gone back and forth on that. But the big question, and I think you said the phrase itself already, whatever happened to the right to try? If you're kind of already on that downward slope, isn't now I could be wrong about this, but I believe Wisconsin is a right to try state.
Mhm,
Furthermore, I'm
mhm,
almost certain there's federal law that was signed in
mhm,
under the Trump administration back in
mhm.
2018. I could be wrong about that time frame, though.
No, you're absolutely right regarding the right to try law. It just doesn't apply to drugs such as ivermectin that are being banned solely for the reason that they are off label, which is ridiculous when you consider that there's many drugs every day that are prescribed for an off label use, and there's not a problem with them. There's only a problem with this drug. And I believe that the reason there's a problem with this drug goes right back to the vaccines,
Yes.
which would make these hospital patients who have died sadly collateral damage,
Well,
which is very harsh.
no,
Because, go
go
ahead.
ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say that the reason that I believe that ivermectin is banned, and it is banned from everywhere in Wisconsin. In fact, any
Mhm.
doctor trying to prescribe it is going to find their license is comes under scrutiny, and that has happened with multiple doctors that I am aware of. And there's no reason for this to be taking place. We're talking about a legal drug with a 40-year safety record,
Mhm.
even won a Nobel Prize.
Right.
So the reason I believe that this is being withheld is because if there is a successful alternative that is being used, then the emergency use authorization for these vaccines goes away.
Well,
And
my understanding
yeah,
is that when it comes to the vaccine, so you have, the one from Pfizer, which is the most popular one out there.
mhm,
Um, but the media was touting that, okay, the Pfizer vaccine has been authorized by the FDA. But my understanding is there's actually two Pfizer vaccines. There's the commercial one, which is community, and then the one that's still given to people up to this present day. And my understanding is that particular one is still under EUA. And I further understand, and I could be wrong about this too, that they say that there's no difference between the two. If there's no difference between the two, then why is there a separation between FDA approved one and EUA the second?
I have not, I do not know if the chemical analysis says they are actually completely the same. They
Mhm.
could be, I'm just not aware of that information. But it is my understanding that Comirnaty is not available yet and that they are still using the original, which is under the EUA, as you said.
Right. Now you mentioned that you took some of these cases and took them up to the Supreme Court here in the state, and they just didn't hear them. What was the grounds that they didn't even hear? Because they didn't even look at the merit of the case.
Right, right.
They just outright didn't want to hear it.
They didn't want to hear it. They turned their back on a dying man.
Wow.
And that's why I would urge you and your listeners to read the scathing dissents by Rebecca Bradley that were joined by the other two. She really does get it down to the basics. She talks about life. She talks about how they rarely have the opportunity to weigh in on something as important as this, and really couldn't understand why they wouldn't make a decision on this, because they could have at least allowed him to be given the ivermectin and then ruled on the bigger question in, in time.
Right.
But what this did is it really made it difficult to help other families too, with this case hanging out there. In fact, this case has still not been decided. We're over 6 months now, and there is nothing on the ruling, and I'm not sure when that is going to come out. I'm not sure that that they would like it to come out in light of what we have seen with all of the deaths and the injuries. I'm sure your listeners are aware of theirs.
Yes.
This is the adverse reporting website, and to date we have over 26,000 deaths in this country, and that is known to be underreported by about 90%. So if we're looking at those numbers, we're really looking at over 200,000 deaths in this country. And just to compare that, back in 1976, we had the swine flu vaccine. After 53, that's 53 deaths, the government stopped that program because it was considered too many deaths.
Right.
And you compare 53 with 200,000 and you go, what is going on? When did it become okay for our federal government to experiment on its citizens? When did it ever become okay? It's never been okay. I know it's happened in the past. It's never been right, and it's never going to be right. And I will do what I can to stop it.
Well, that's always been one of the issues I had, even when then President Trump was talking about it. I had my concerns about it because I don't like first generation technology,
Mm-hmm,
whether it's a
mm-hmm,
video game system, a brand new type of car, a new type of entertainment. It doesn't matter. First generation technology, I've had nothing but the worst of luck with that. And this is one
right.
of those things where it's like, that's great that they were actually able to move things fast. So fast and get things out there. But again, where are the long-term studies? You're
Mm-hmm.
not going to have them. You kind of
Well,
have to take it on faith.
and you can't take it on faith. They skipped the animal trials.
Right.
The trials that they did do, all the animals died. Um, the thing is that the more we're finding out about this, this wasn't something that they miraculously came up with. There are patents out on these um, shots that go back 20 years.
Hmm.
And in fact, there are people out there that believe that these are, in fact, bioweapons. I have talked to a man by the name of Francis Boyle. He's a law professor at Chicago. He wrote the Bioweapons Anti-Terrorism Act of 1989. I've talked at length with him. He believes that this is, in fact, a bioweapon. He
Wow.
believes that we are in a genocide. And those are the two primary reasons I'm running,
Mhm.
because people are dying and we need to find out why. First, we need to stop it, and we need to find out what is going on here. But there should be a complete stoppage of these shots until we
Right.
get to the bottom of what's going on. I mean, we're talking about possibly 200,000 people killed,
Mhm.
but that doesn't even begin to uh, take into account the people that are permanently disabled now with neurological, heart conditions, myocarditis. All
Yes.
these things are being ignored. They're being ignored by the press. When they're not being ignored, they're using that characterization to slander me.
Right.
When I got into the race, it was, I'm getting into the race to investigate my baseless
Hmm.
allegations. They're not baseless. The people calling me on the phone weren't baseless.
Right.
The number of people that have been injured are not baseless. They have names, they have loved ones that are now dead. And so It's yet to be determined whether there is homicide involved here, but there are certainly deaths.
Well, I think that's the importance of at least having some type of investigation for something like that,
Hmm.
especially if if you're dealing with, did an individual not get proper medical care, or was that the standard of care at that time? The monetary thing just always had disturbed me because there was a payment if you were diagnosed with COVID. There was a
Hmm.
payment if you were admitted, a payment if you got ventilated. There was a payment if it went further on. That's never sat right with me, and that's been something that's been going on since the beginning of this whole unfortunate ordeal we've had to deal with. Um, but I want to move on to something else here that's also big on your platform, and I kind of joke about this a little bit with people because I tell people it's like, you know what, every 2 months or so, there's a new topic du jour that everyone's going to talk about. Go back to August, everyone's preaching about CRT, then became medical freedom. I forgot what the last one was. Now, a lot of people are talking about election integrity. Obviously, there's definitely a variety of opinions on what happened in the election 2020 as it relates to
Hmm.
President Trump.
Hmm.
Um, I've got my opinions. A lot of other people do as well too. But you've actually taken action on this here, so I
I
kind of like to
did.
get into that a little bit. And just kind of see what your thoughts are. And I know you've had a piece that came out, and you're also the founder too. I would add this for the make sure I got this right. This was the Amos Center for Justice and Law or Liberty. Is that correct?
Liberty. Hmm.
Yep.
Hmm. I
So you
started
guys
that a
actually had
year
a
and a half
release.
ago. I started the Amos Center a year and a half ago. I've been a solo practitioner for over 20 years, and nothing out of the ordinary, very run of the mill employment law, some guardian ad litem work, um, nothing earth shattering about it at all. But in the civil rights, in the wake of the pandemic, as I started seeing the loss of liberties everywhere, people being told to put their masks on, people being told to stay home, all of these things were just terrible burdens on our liberty, given the number of deaths that we weren't seeing.
Mhm.
And the lies that I could already tell that the government was coming up with. The PCR tests were wrong by about 90%. Why
Yep.
were they using them? And then continuing to fan the flames. None of this was making sense to me. So that's why I started the Amos Center for Justice. And that's why it came about. But then came the election. And the day after the election, I looked at my husband and I said, where did all those absentee ballot drop boxes come from? Because I've never heard of them before in Wisconsin. I did not know anything about them. And so, since I'm a lawyer, I started looking up the statutes to see what the election law was on it. And what I found was that under the plain meaning of the statutes, those boxes were illegal and
Mhm.
never should have been used. And yet, in my research, I found out there were 500 of them,
Right.
over 500 that were thrown all around the state of Wisconsin. And so I just started digging into that and how they came about. And that led me to Megan Wolf's document, which was the model, which was the guidelines, where she was basically telling the clerks that they could go get the absentee ballot drop boxes
Mhm.
and that CTCL would pay for them. And but from there, I did some more research, and what I found was the actual model guidelines that she used came out of the federal government. And so they came out of an organization called CISA. Some people say CISA,
Yes.
and that's the sub agency out of the Department of Homeland Security. And so I found this organization is pushing out these model guidelines uh, to all 50 states. And they're using national nonprofits to push the documents down. And one
And
of
if I
them is, excuse me?
oh, I was gonna say, if I understand correctly too, these organizations, they were initiated during the tail end of President Obama's his last term. Was that correct?
Um, the national nonprofits are old organizations.
Okay.
They the NCSL, National Conference of State Legislators, and NASS, the National Association of Secretaries of States, have actually been around a very long time as national nonprofits. Their members are either legislators of any one of the 50 states, or their members are a Secretary of State of any one of the states.
Okay.
So that's where they get their membership from. But what happened was that this was in the lame duck session of President Obama's presidency. His secretary of the Department of Homeland Security uh, basically conscripted those organizations. What I mean by that is that he said that they were going to be critical infrastructure for elections, which
Okay.
to me struck me as an odd thing to do in a lame duck session when you're leaving office. All of a sudden, you're concerned about critical infrastructure regarding elections.
Mhm.
And none of this made a lot of sense. Um, I'm sure it would have been very confusing had I known at the time, but looking back on it, I'm going, well, that's interesting. It looks like there was a setup quite early here for some of this. By the way, just as a coincidence, maybe that was the same 2 week period that Anthony Fauci said on video that Trump will face a pandemic in his
Yes.
presidency. Quite prescient. And so, um, so those organizations became uh, usable by the federal government. You know, once you're critical infrastructure, then the federal government starts pouring the money in. And then, of course, they have the ability to tell you what to do. And
Right.
so those organizations became very useful to the federal government. My position is that the federal government has no business meddling in state election law because that is left to the states to make that law. And so I think even the model guidelines that they were pushing out is actually violates the Constitution. I don't think they had any business doing that.
And if I recall correctly, too, I believe it was prior to the 2020 election, even President Obama was very, very confident about our whole election system in saying that it's too decentralized. There's no way that there should be any shenanigans. But if what you're saying is accurate there, that blows decentralization of the electric system just completely out of the water because now it's being guided, manipulated, and worked through a centralized authority.
Absolutely. And that was never the intention of the founders. It is the states that created the federal government. The states are the ones that have their own election systems, and it was to remain that way. And now we have the federal government, as you said, centralizing power. And I think this is a big problem. And I think Americans need to know what's going on. And I don't think they're aware of it. We need to be able to continue to hold our state legislators accountable. And that's what we're trying to do in Wisconsin, and we're having a heck of a time.
Right.
Your listeners might be interested in knowing that our own Speaker of the Assembly, Robin Voss, also gave his stamp of approval to the absentee ballot drop boxes. And he did that in a letter that was written on his behalf by his attorneys, both his and Scott Fitzgerald, who at the time was a leader in the Senate in Wisconsin. And what they basically wrote a letter to the Dane County, it was either Dane County or the City of Madison clerk. And what they were saying is, we think you shouldn't be doing the democracy in the park. However, we think that the absentee ballot boxes are just great. We wholeheartedly agree with them. The problem with that is that we don't have kings in Wisconsin. And those two men did not have the authority to make election law without the rest of the legislative body. And they
Right.
did it on their own.
Let me. I'm gonna give you just a little bit of pushback on this one here because, um, while I think I agree with the vast majority of what you're saying on that. The one thing that kind of comes to me during that time was okay, so COVID got declared a national pandemic. I believe it was March 13th
Hmm.
of 2020.
Hmm.
I remember that day also well. We were in
Hmm.
the Dells. It was the first time I took vacation in like several years. I'll
Hmm.
never take vacation again. That's what happens when I take vacation. It's my fault.
Hmm.
But no, wasn't no lab leak. Um, but March 17th comes around. Governor Evers shuts down the state. Um, and now all of a sudden we're inundated with news reports, and it's like extinction level event type of thing. It's like a really bad movie with a really bad plot.
Hmm.
And there's no sports, there's no entertainment, there's no nothing. You're being deemed essential, not essential, all these other things. And I get it. I think the first couple months, I get it. People were scared because you didn't necessarily know what you're dealing with. This was something
Hmm.
very novel,
Hmm.
and nothing had been, I hate to use the word promoted, but I'm going to use that for lack of a better word, to the
Hmm.
level which we have seen before. In
Hmm.
my almost 50 years on this planet, I've never seen this country locked down, not even to that degree. I did not even see that during 9/11.
Right.
And I lived on a military base during that time.
Hmm.
But that being said, though, I get it. People were scared. I don't think there was any excuse for violating the law or trying to find a workaround, but I get it. People were scared. I would submit that in saying that were they trying to, is there any possibility that it's like, hey, we want to try to do this as safely as possible? And I don't know the answer to that.
Well, what I can tell you is that Robin Voss and Scott Fitzgerald were two of the three men in the state that had the ability to call an emergency session, and they could have made those boxes legal with the snap of their fingers. They could have done that very quickly, and there would have not been any problem. I will also say that the absentee ballot drop box guidelines that Megan Wolf created left out some important information that actually came down from the federal government in their model rules or in
Mhm.
their model guideline, which would have involved things like making sure that there was a bipartisan team going out to check the ballot drop, when you pick them up.
Yes.
So there was things that were left out of there that at the very least are suspicious in that when you leave stuff out, a lawyer tends to go, that seem like they should have
Mhm.
been put in, you question the intent there. And so it's something that certainly needs to be looked at
Right. You start
again
seeing missing
in
pieces, and
that.
it's like, this doesn't add up.
Right. And regarding just the physical, I've talked to doctors about the boxes, and they said, you know what, if you want to prevent the spread of COVID, the way to do it wasn't to have a box that multiple people put their hands on every day. Um, that just wouldn't be something that would
Hmm.
help to mitigate the spread of COVID. And so there's aspect too. I would just say this seemed to be too well thought out and it was like everything was ready to go.
Hmm.
And that makes me suspicious. It doesn't mean I know what went on, but it does mean there needs to be an investigation into
Yeah.
this.
Yeah, no doubt with that. Um, I want to switch gears here a little bit, but before I do, I don't know if you've had an opportunity to see the Time Magazine article. It was written up last year, and early part of last year was called "The Shadow Campaign to Save Democracy." And I do despise that word democracy because we're a constitutional republic, not a
That's correct.
democracy.
Hmm.
But it was an interesting thing because the way it came across was that a lot of laws were changed across various jurisdictions around the nation, whether it's like mail-in voting, where like you had in, I think it was Pennsylvania, and that actually got struck down as unconstitutional after the
Hmm.
fact.
Right.
And several other places had, basically workarounds. And there's a lot of that kind of, when you look at the whole ball of wax, you just kind of, you can't help but wonder and really want to investigate more into this. Um, but I want to move on to something else here because while I think these issues are really important, um, as you're looking for the attorney general, one of the things that we're seeing with our current attorney general is Him.
Mhm,
And I say that because we're dealing with out of control crime throughout the state, more
mhm,
so in the Metro Milwaukee area, um, Madison, Green Bay.
mhm.
We had the Summer of Love during 2020. If you remember that, that was
Right.
just the best time, Kenosha. Um,
Mhm,
when we take a look at these low bail, no bail happenings and everything else, I'd like to get your thoughts on just the state of, I don't know, state of disarray here in Wisconsin as it relates to criminal activity here
mhm,
in Wisconsin.
mhm. Um, First of all, I would say, um, I am the wife of a 28-year police officer. I'm the mother of a 20-year Marine Corps police officer, and
Semper
so I
Fi.
have experience being a family member. And I just wanted to say that because there is a bias in that. There
Yes.
is bias to make sure that the police are given the tools and the support that they need to effectively fight crime. And so I just want to make sure that people are aware of where I'm coming from um, in that matter. I don't think low bail for violent crime helps anyone. It doesn't help people that are having to live in the midst of high crime areas where their children can't walk the streets. They can't, in some cases, they can't safely even be in their homes.
Right.
There's something wrong where in the state of Wisconsin, we have places where children can't play safely. And I'm totally against that and would do whatever I can to make sure that violent criminals are put in jail and stay in jail and serve out their sentences. I am not a person who is in favor of uh, of certainly low bail for violent criminals. That doesn't make any sense to me. To put people out on the street again that have already injured people or killed people. So,
You know, and Milwaukee's kind of been known as this area where the revolving door of the criminal justice system.
mhm,
Somebody comes in, they go out, a day or two later or whatever it is, and it's usually a short amount of time. And it's almost so short that it can become a rite of passage for some people.
mhm,
And I think that's one of the issues that we had when we saw back in December with the Waukesha massacre that happened out there. And I will frame it as such
it
because I
was.
don't. That was not an accident. It was a massacre. You
Yes.
take a vehicle, you run it through a crowd of people. That's just evil. But here's a guy who should not have been let out at all. And if I recall
Ye-
correctly, he was let out on $1,000 bail. And I
Well,
believe he had hit another person earlier.
that's the interesting twist in this is that he had already proved he was willing to harm people, take people's lives with using a vehicle. So, number one, why was he let out on a low bail? Why did he even have a vehicle at that point? If he'd been using a dangerous weapon, that would have been removed from him. I mean, he'd already tried to, my understanding is to run over a person. So,
Yes.
these things don't make sense to me. In fact, I think that's a lot of what's wrong with our criminal justice system is things don't make sense. There's no common sense that is being applied here and it hurts people. We have to get back to a time where there is common sense being used, where there is equal protection under the law,
Hmm.
for each individual, but there has to also be protection for society where somebody has proved that they are, just by their actions, that they are dangerous to
Right.
others.
Well, and it's kind of a little off topic, but it could potentially be related depending on how we frame this. But that's why I'm a big advocate of the death penalty. And I say it like that because when you look at these actions that are so egregious, that when you have a jury of your peers saying, you know what you done was just so horrible, so heinous that you have forfeited your right to further exist. I advocate for that all day long. Wisconsin, I know, doesn't have that. It is life in prison.
Hmm.
You can live with that too.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
this does bring up a question, and it's It's always an interesting question to pose this because when you take a look at our criminal justice system, it is something I think when we talk about the reforming of it, could it use it? Could it not? Because now we're trying to answer this age old question. What is the penal system for? What is, law enforcement for? Is it restitution? Is it restorative? Is it retribution? Uh, these are all things I think that we as a human race have tried to deal with for
Mhm,
millennia. And I don't think
mhm,
we've gotten it right.
mhm.
Um, is there a way to reform our current incarceration system, our current criminal justice system, with yourself as at the helm of the attorney general?
Well, if I am elected, I will tell you that the pendulum will swing back towards um, uh, higher bails and probably longer sentences. If I have anything to say about it, I will be asking for those. I will be asking for help through the legislature to make changes to the system. Um, again, just deferring back to my husband, he was in law enforcement
Yes.
long enough that I've heard him repeatedly talk about how he saw several cycles of the pendulum swinging towards
Hmm.
leniency and then back the other way and then towards leniency, and that's where we've been. But the thing is that the carnage that society has to put up with is too much, and then we go back the other way again. And so I guess it's probably going to continue to swing, but I think it has to go back here now. I think we have seen too much carnage again. And what you saw, or, in Waukesha is too much. And what we are seeing in what we saw in Kenosha is totally unacceptable. And that would not happen under my watch. There would be, I would at least urge the governor to immediately take action and do
Right.
whatever I can under the law.
Well, I think that's another thing too. You mentioned, carnage, and I think that's probably the best word for it because I would have to agree with you wholeheartedly that we are in this cycle of carnage because you have this mantra from a lot of people on the left, defund the police and ACAB. I'm not going to say what that is on air here,
Mhm.
but it's a derogatory. So if you're in law enforcement, you know what it is. But you hear a lot of talk about that and also talk about removing qualified immunity for law enforcement officers. Um, I don't think there's any such thing as bad training. I think they certainly need more funding so they can get better training, better equipment, and everything else. To swing the pendulum back to a place of moderation, of common sense,
Mhm.
how do we go about doing that?
Well, first of all, you do have to change the laws. You do have to change the attorney general because
For
currently the
sure.
attorney general um, is unwilling to, I think, prosecute certain crimes, goes too easy on crimes. So that would be the first step there. And then you have to look at where do we need to increase the punishments? Where do we need to increase the bail? To make
Mhm.
sure that society is safe. The thing is that right now there has been a big movement for perpetrators' rights for the
Right.
people in prison, but there's also society's rights and innocent people who are going about their daily lives. They go to work or kids go to school and they're being affected. And
Mhm.
that's not a civilized society, and we need to move back towards there. The problem is that there's a cost. There's a financial cost to that, and
Right.
people in Wisconsin need to be able to willing to pay that. They have to be to pay that the increased cost of prisons or jails,
Right.
um, and then they have to weigh that against the ethical concerns, the moral concerns. But overall, we're talking about people who have perpetrated violent crimes. I think that we can agree that there has to be we have to look at the crimes in terms of the violence.
Yes.
Historically, that's what we have to do, because that has everything to do with the future safety of people.
Hmm.
And again, the carnage that we talked about in Waukesha is just a terrible example of what
Right.
happens when somebody who is already shown to be violent is released.
Yep.
So, yeah.
No doubt about that. Um, this was something that I often think about here, especially during this election cycle. We look at what's happening on the federal level. You got the Biden administration out there running roughshod on everything, and even during the Trump years, any Democrat governor would still try to run roughshod. They would still try to say, "Well, we're going to do X, Y, or Z. We're going to be a sanctuary state for illegals. We're going to do whatever. Doesn't matter what the federal government says." How will you, as the Attorney General, help to provide a seawall against an overreaching federal government? Because when we see the left doing this in California, it's like, well, they're just ignoring laws altogether. I mean, laws that have been in the books forever. But how do we prevent or mitigate, I should say, an overreaching federal government that wants to rule through executive fiat?
We have a 10th Amendment and we need to be using it. We have a Ninth Amendment. We need to be making sure that where the government is overreaching, that the state, through its legislature, is standing up and is saying, we're not going there. And or just saying, no, no, this isn't something that we're going to follow. And you have overreached your authority, because it is the states, again, that made the federal government, and the rights not enumerated, as you well know,
Yeah.
in the Constitution, are reserved to the states. And that's not emphasized enough. And in fact, I think we have had a long time here where the government has continued to overreach in various areas simply because the states are weak, or the legislators are uninformed, or spineless, any number of issues.
When I
Just
think
afraid.
when I think often too, they there's a lot of tying purse strings, with strings that come along with that.
Hmm.
Probably the best known example of that is, the federal highway system
Hmm.
when they wanted to take drinking age from 18 to 21. Well, if you want that money, you're going to raise that drinking age to 21.
Right, right.
So it's kind of hard to turn down, that time. I'm sure millions of dollars, but now we're talking significantly higher, adjusted for inflation.
Yeah, and we're seeing that in every program in the country, right down to what I was talking about earlier with Medicare and Medicaid. I mean, look at what they're being able to do with their federal dollars that are coming into the healthcare system, and the unbelievable power, actually to the power of killing people, is now being unleashed in the hospitals. This has to stop, and there's people across this country are going to have to stand up and say, no more. We're going to have a total revamping of our tax system. Why are we sending all these dollars to Washington? I mean, this is getting out of my area in terms of attorney
But I'm glad you're
general.
going there. I'm glad you're
Um,
going there.
so it's not, it's out of my purview as a future attorney general, but my conservative beliefs say, why are we doing this? Why are all these dollars going to Washington so they can basically turn around and wrap them into a new grant package, turn around, send them back to us and say, here, but there are those strings attached, as you
Right.
say. I think we need to do a severe tax rationing to the federal government. That's my belief. The states can handle this, and the people in the legislature can handle this, especially when the people are awake and are willing to hold them accountable. To hold our legislators at the state level. I can think, I will say, I ran for Congress in 2014 in the
Yes,
third
ma'am.
district of Wisconsin. I ran unsuccessfully. I came in second in a three-way primary, but I ran on a platform then not only of defending the Constitution and restoring our freedoms, the same I am now, but back then, I believed that we needed to get rid of the Department of Education. We need to get rid of the Department of Agriculture. Because of things I've learned, I've now added to the very top of that is Health and Human Services. That
Mhm.
organization is so corrupt, so unneeded, and we have to get rid of it, and we have to get our country back. And so just me becoming attorney general isn't going to solve the problems we have. We need to have a lot of conservative patriots that
Yes.
are standing up all at once. And I think we've got a number of them this time. And I hope that your audience will consider voting for them.
Yeah, there's a lot of great candidates out here, and I've had a chance to talk to a ton of people, and I definitely, look forward to talking to more because I think,
Hmm.
the more information we can get out here, because mainstream media is not going to give us this information.
Hmm.
Oftentimes they'll censor us, they'll want to shut it
Hmm.
down.
Hmm.
But you know what? We're going to find the workarounds around
Hmm.
that. You mentioned something I think that was actually very important because I hear candidates and I love them all. Don't get me wrong. I've Every candidate that I've met, I've got a great relationship with. We can have our disagreements, but we can still, shake hands and have a laugh at the end of the day. But
Hmm.
a couple of the candidates kind of seem they're a little boastful, and I'm gonna do this. It's like, whoa, slow down here. You can't really do too much. Nobody can really do much on their own. Governor,
Right,
perhaps.
right.
How do you build relationships in order to achieve some of the things that we're talking about? So, as Attorney General, I would throw that question to you as well, because I think as Attorney General, building relationships has got to be extremely important, not only on the county levels, but
Hmm.
also within the elected body of the legislature, the executive branch, and
Hmm.
everywhere else. If you could
Hmm.
expand upon that, we'll make that our last question here as we're closing in on the hour here.
Okay, yeah. Well, my understanding is that our current Attorney General has done a lot to cut areas, important areas that we need to have restored. And of course, that happened through the Evers administration. And I would say, frankly, that for the types of investigations that I'm talking about doing, and of course, maintaining law and order in the state, we are going to have to look at budget increases for the Attorney General's department. My understanding is that the Department of Justice, the number of prosecutors, the number of attorneys and other staff have been that it has in fact been understaffed. And we're going to have
Mhm.
to take a serious look at that because you get what you pay for. And if Wisconsinites want things to turn around, if they want investigations done, whether it's on the election or deaths in the hospital or why in the world these so called vaccines are killing people, then there is a cost with that. And to that end, I do need a good relationship with not only the governor, but I would also need that with the legislators. And hopefully, there will be a new batch of legislators coming in that will see that and see that we are going to have to put money into the right place, and maybe we can cut in other areas.
Right.
Why do we need a Department of Education? We have local school boards.
Mhm.
Again, at this point, with what I have seen transpire, I am thinking that Health and Human Services can be cut significantly. And there's probably other programs. But I'm not sure with the way that Health and Human Services has been operated in the past 2 years, why we need a continuance of that when they have done nothing but say that vaccines are safe and effective while they're killing people and injuring people. That's not a service to the people of Wisconsin. That's harming them.
Right.
So we have to take a serious look at what we're doing here.
Yep. I think you're absolutely right about that, especially when you talk about the elimination of certain governmental agencies. Department of Education is the one that really strikes out to me because like everything you need is right here.
Right.
Or is this
Mhm.
you know,
Right.
kind of like a shell game, just shuffling money around?
Hmm. I mean, we didn't get into, CRT, but I mean, we've got
Oh yeah.
centralized education. We've got basically a forum for propaganda. of re-educating our children, or educating them in a way that most people don't want their children
Mhm.
educated. So
Well, and it's interesting, you bring up CRT. I mean, that's something when you look at, do we really want the state, federal government dictating these type of things, especially when a lot of it falls, that it just goes against actual historic fact. And a
yes.
lot of this was, brought about by the 1619 Project.
Hmm.
I believe that was the New York Times that has sponsored that, if I recall correctly. But yeah, oh, don't get me started on that. We can do a whole nother hour on that one.
Okay.
Goodness. All right. So what I'm going to do here first, I want to thank you so much for your time. I really do value the time that you've been able to offer me here and our guests. I know we've got people that were in the chat room, and I'm going to respond back to them here after the broadcast. But one of the things that I like to do at the end of every episode is I'm going to take myself off screen for a moment, and I would love you to kind of just tell, in the next, 2, 3 minutes, tell people about yourself, why they should vote for you. As you see, I have your website right down below here. And as I ask everybody, make sure you check your website out. If Karen Mueller is the candidate for you, make sure you find a way to donate, help her campaign, especially this month. Everybody needs signatures. Big deal there.
Hmm.
So,
It is.
uh, with that, I'm going to take myself off air for a second, but I'm going to bring you on full screen, and I'm going to let you kind of give your pitch, please.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. I appreciate the people that are listening tonight, and I thank you for allowing me to come on and talk about what it is that has brought me to the point of entering this race a month and a half ago. I am pro-life. I was endorsed by Pro-Life Wisconsin, which means 100% pro-life, and that is from conception to natural death. And that, of course, is my interest in what is going on with the vaccines, what is going on with people in hospital being deprived of food, being deprived of water, then being deprived of medicines that may help them, while at the same time they're giving medicines that are more akin to poisons. I'm not a medical doctor, but again, I can read the labels, and so can you. And we've had so many deaths and so many injuries because of the vaccines. In my estimation, well, I have started calling them what Francis Boyle, the law professor that I spoke about earlier, he calls them Frankenshots, and he is convinced that they are bioweapons. I think we need to have a full investigation. I wonder when it became okay for the federal government to be killing American citizens. It has never been right. Of course, it has happened in the past. And I don't think that we can ignore this anymore. We have people in Washington that need, at the very least, to be removed from office, or we have bureaucrats behind the scenes that need to be investigated. And I will do that as Attorney General. It is my intent to call on other attorney generals and to work with them, and to be able to form a coalition of attorney generals to get to the bottom of what has transpired here in Washington with these shots, and how this was rolled out, and why it has not stopped when we have so many deaths across the country. And finally, I'm also interested in election integrity. As we talked about, I brought a case, Mueller v. Weck, within 30 days of the election. And in that case, I discovered that the absentee ballot drop boxes were being used, uh, and they were being used illegally, and that the Speaker of the Assembly, Robin Voss, had okayed them. And I don't believe he okayed them in a way that was legal, because we don't have kings, and because he could have called for a special session and made them legal. Pandemics do not suspend the Constitution; they do not suspend the laws. And we also have, I think there were grave disparities in the number of actual deaths and actual harm from the pandemic, as opposed to what our government organizations were reporting. And I think that they have hyped them in a way that, again, there needs to be investigations into why did this happen? Why do we have a press that continues to lie? Why do we have a media with Mark Zuckerberg and other people that continues to censor us? We have a First Amendment. And the thing is that if we have a Mark Zuckerberg who is a private actor, then the First Amendment doesn't apply. If we have Mark Zuckerberg who is actually working for government actors, then he may have violated the First Amendment. And that also needs to be looked into. We have many, many different media sources that are acting as censors today. And we need to take a serious look at what is going on here. America is a free country. America has a constitution, and that is what people rely on, is the rights that we have. And if I'm elected, I will be looking into these matters as long as I have. Unfortunately, I need to have a budget to do that. And while I hate talking about that, that's a reality. And I think it's only fair that people know right away that I would be asking for an increase in that, so that down the road they don't say, you didn't tell me that. I thank you, and I would ask for your vote. I ask for your prayers, and I do need financial help. I'm a very much a grassroots candidate. I am not establishment. And despite the fact that I have been involved in the Republican Party, I am not necessarily the candidate that the establishment would like to see in, because I do have strong opinions, and I am not going to be controlled, and I'm not going to be bought. I am somebody that will do what I say that I'm going to do. And I thank you very much. And I just pray that we can work through this together, and that you will be able to determine not only who is the best candidate for the Attorney General, but also for the governor and all of the legislators that are running around the state. I do believe that on the backside of this race, if we don't pick the right candidates, I think we are going to see a very dark time in this state's history and in this nation's history. And I would hate to see that happen. So thank you, and God bless you.
Well, thank you so much, Karen. I really appreciate your time. I wish you all the luck in your primary race here. I know it's going to be it's been a hot, primary season as it is.
Hmm.
Hopefully I'll actually be able to have the opportunity to meet you at convention if you're going to be attending.
Hmm.
I'm going to be making it a
Hmm.
point to be there.
Hmm.
So, I'm sure it'll be good times had by all.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you so much for having me on.
Yes, ma'am, and I appreciate it. Anytime you want to come back on and have more conversation, I would love to, because I did not even get to half the stuff I wrote down. There's so much we can do.
Okay.
So,
All
thank
right.
you again. Have a
I love that.
wonderful night.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye. All right, guys, that was Karen Mueller, and she's going to be running for the Attorney General's race. We had a great conversation here, hour long. I will be going to the chat room here later on tonight and responding back to some of the chats. So I want you guys know I haven't forgot about you. Just want to keep these conversations as open and flowing as possible. So, on that note, I want to thank you guys for joining in here tonight. Next week, we're going to have more guests on. So, keep eyes open for that. You will see, as you see on the bottom down here, this will be put on the audio only platform. So you'll hear it on Spotify, iTunes, Spreaker.com. It's all your other podcast aggregators. So thank you again. Good night. God bless you guys. Thank you, Karen Mueller. And God bless the United States of America. God bless Wisconsin. I'm out.